Thank you everyone for joining us. We're just going to wait a few moments while everyone enters into the room. I'll have a few church announcements and then we will get us started. All right, if we can just wait a few more moments. Mine is still ticking up. Awesome. So I'm just going to start us off with a few announcements. Then I'm going to hand it over to our facilitators of the chapter chat today. My name is Amelia. I'm from the New York State chapter of NASW, and I'm so thankful for the great group that we have joined with us this evening. This is a chapter chat through the New York State chapter of NASW. Chapter chats do not hold CE credit. So if you are coming for CEs, I wanted to make sure that I mention that right up front. This program itself does not hold CEs. However, we do have many CEs available for membership. We guarantee at minimum 36 CEs for the renewal of your license with your membership. So if you are interested in CEs, shoot us an email. We're going to pop that email right into the chat box shortly. This presentation is Positive Disruption of Social Work Practice and Leadership from a Trauma-Informed DEI Lens. This is with Dr. Laura Quiros, whom has done previous programs with our chapter, and we are really grateful to have her here to host this discussion this evening. Laura is an associate professor of social work at Adelphi, and she has been there for the past 11 years. She teaches social work practice at the doctoral, at the master's, and the undergraduate levels. Her research and scholarly interests focus on social construction of racial and ethnic identity and trauma-informed care from a social justice lens. The common thread in her consulting, in her teaching, and in her scholarship is elevating complexity and furthering the mission of social justice, including diversity and inclusion. She also coaches and trains executive level staff across higher education, corporate and nonprofit, and the fashion industry to dig intimately and to connect to diversity and inclusion. Some of this work involves getting pushed to the boundaries of overcoming this resistance involved with diversity and inclusion. So we really want you to be able to engage in this conversation with us today. So the ways that we're going to do that are both through chat. If there's conversation happening, it's not an appropriate time to jump in, but you have something to say, we really want to encourage everyone to chat with one another. We always have robust conversation there, so don't be shy. And also there's going to be a point in which we really just want to hear from you. I'm going to be quiet. We want to hear the questions that you have for Laura about the content of this book, about how it came together, the process of writing it both personally and professionally. So we're going to rely on you all to tease out the information that is most important, because you do know that. So I am going to be quiet. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to hand it over to our Executive Director, Sam Fletcher.
Good evening. Thank you all for joining us. I can't tell you how excited I am about this topic. I feel like this goes hand in hand with revolutionize the profession, what we've been working on at the chapter with really working toward a racially just social work profession. I want to thank Dr. Laura Quiros for joining us. Amelia forgot to tell you, we're actually going to do 2 book giveaways tonight. So there'll be a drawing. So when the book comes out in late December, we will be mailing it to the winners. I say 2, I said 1 because I wanted to read the other one, but I'm going to go ahead and do both. And I'll just buy another copy for myself, because as I read about this book, I cannot wait to get into it. I feel like this should become a seminal part of social work education. I feel like every school of social work should have this, and every social worker should have it, and it be one of the core books we read. So I don't want to talk anymore because we need to hear from our star. So Laura, I just want to start by asking if you can tell us about your book.
Sure. Thanks, Samantha and Amelia. You know, first, I just want to, and I will tell you about the book in its full depth in 1 second, but I just want to honor the community that came together tonight. I'm looking at the participant number. It's 101 people. I understand that people are very busy. It's the week after Thanksgiving. People are calling in from across the country. And I just really want to take a moment to honor the social workers in the room, my friends, my family, my students who have showed up tonight, the Adelphi community, and anyone else who is here tonight. Thank you for sharing space with us. And so that's first and foremost. And secondly, you know, those of you who know me know that I sort of start with grounding us in sort of how we're showing up today. So before I even begin, and I think we've already begun by Amelia's great introduction, but just paying attention tonight to how you're showing up. You know, for some of you, it's 6 o'clock at night. For some of you, it's 3. For some of you, it's 4. It's been a long day. It's the middle of the day. So just really pay attention to how you're listening to what we share today and to what each other is sharing today, because it's our hope also that this becomes a community. People are calling in from, you know, across the country, across the world. So I want us to pay attention to the questions people ask and what resonates for you in my own story. One of my hopes tonight is that you leave here with some inspiration, with some bravery and courage to tell your own stories, with some bravery and courage to disrupt status quo spaces, and bravery to speak up around ways when you've chosen to be silent for whatever reason. And I'd also love if other people left here with some healing tonight as well. So, you know, my story of my book is a long one. And so, you know, in the formal sense, transformational leadership is a framework for social work practice that integrates trauma and integrates diversity, equity, inclusion. And so just from a macro level, and then I'm going to go back to sort of my personal space, but from a macro level, I found a gap in both trauma-informed practice, and I found a gap in happened to also coincide with my life experience. And so what I did was I wrote a book that intersected those two worlds. And by doing that, also positively disrupted social work practice. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what that theoretical framework means. I also just want to give a special shout out to my brother with us tonight, who served as my silent right-hand editor the whole time. And I could not have written this book. I could not have dreamed of writing this book without him. So I want to name him in this space tonight as well. And so my story kind of begins with this book. It ended up, you know, this book came out during COVID-19 and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and a time in our country that was filled with racial injustice. Nothing that we hadn't seen before, but it was an intensity, a lot driven by the pandemic and the disparity that we saw. And so the end game of this for me, and while I was writing it during those months, was really a moral obligation that I had to speak to social work practice in a way that I hadn't done before, right? And so specifically what I mean by that was I took qualities of social work. I took words in social work, such as leadership, cultural competency, practice, and I started to look at those in a way that wasn't from a white lens. And so those of us who have been in the field a while may understand better than some new students in the field that social work is grounded in a social justice mission. Ironically, social work wasn't doing a very good job of living up to that mission and really not interrogating whiteness and how that showed up in different spaces. So that's the end game of this, right? It really was a moral obligation that I had during the pandemic and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement to write a story that disrupted traditional social work practice. So I wanted you to just hold that for a minute, and I want to go back now. And so the book is broken up into 6 different chapters. And at the beginning of every chapter, I start by this practice principle I call of locating myself. And what I mean by that was I locate myself in each moment of my life that had areas of trauma and that also had areas of racism and anti-Semitism, which I'll go into in a minute. And so I want us to think about, especially those social workers in the room, this concept of locating yourself. Social work is about a person and environment. It is about people and their environment. So to think that the practitioner or the person isn't part of that environment is a misnomer. And so my trauma, and I'm going to go into this, and I also want us to hold the idea of storytelling as a way to heal and as storytelling as a way to disruption. So my story began when I was, my story of trauma began when I was 6 years old, and I had a brother named Daniel who died of sudden infant death syndrome. And the story goes like this, that it was Christmas Eve and I was home with, I was supposed to be, my dad was at work and my mom was out, and I was supposed to be babysat by my aunt who happened to go to the store for a little while. And during that time that she was at the store, as any 6-year-old would do, I went into my brother's room to check on him. He was 4 months old at the time. And I found him in his crib and he wasn't breathing. And I knew from my 6-year-old sense that something was wrong, but I just couldn't figure it out. Fast forward hours later, Daniel had died of sudden infant death syndrome. And that was my first intersection with trauma. As a 6-year-old girl back then, there wasn't many resources for me. Obviously, you can imagine the trauma and the pain my parents were going through at the time. And so my sort of healing in that space wasn't necessarily a priority. And so what I decided to do was I decided to commit my life to healing and ultimately to saving Daniel. And so all through elementary school, every creative writing a page, I majored in psychology at Skidmore College, again, with a focus on children and adolescents. And I ended up at Hunter School of Social Work for my master's. And I remember being in my policy class, and one of my mentors, who I learned so much from and hold at such high regard still, Michael Fabricant, was my policy teacher. And the first introduction was to go around the room and talk about purpose. And so for the social workers in the room, particularly the students in the room, thinking about your purpose for entering the field of social work. Social work is a helping profession. And I would say, I would like to generalize that many of us enter this profession from a place of healing, because there has been some trauma or something has happened, and we're entering the field to help, to do good, to heal in whatever way. And so Dr. Fabricant went around the room and he asked what their purpose was for being here. And when it was my turn, I said, I want to save children. And this was, and I write about this in the book, and this is when I named the framework of positive disruption. And this was the first time that my world was disrupted in an educational space. And he looked at me and he said, Laura, you want to save children? If you think that not only are you in the wrong field, but you should be somewhere higher up. You can't save children, and this work isn't about you. And it was, for me in that moment, having lived my whole life trying to heal from Daniel, it was a moment when I thought to myself, wow, this work isn't about me. And as much as I want to help children and save children, Daniel is not going to come back through that. So, I went through the program, amazing program. I had my internships, and I ended up, one of my internships was at, back then in the late 90s, traditional therapeutic communities were the thing. And those of you who had been in the field a long time might remember those, right? Traditional TCs. They were alternative to incarceration programs where clients came instead of jail, and they were very strict, and clients were seen as addicts and nothing else. And so I had an internship there. I ended up working there. And during that internship, I had the incredible opportunity to be trained by Lisa Najavitz, who wrote the Seeking Safety curriculum. And I worked with clients, all of whom were there because they were considered addicts and substance abusers. And through my work with Lisa, we found out that 99.9% of clients who have histories of substance abuse also have histories of trauma. Not only that, the majority of the women that I worked with were also women of color. And so I was running these Seeking Safety groups, and I realized that the group space, as many of you know, could be amazing. It could be a brave space. It could be a safe space. There could be healing. But as soon as those clients re-entered the organizational culture, a lot of them would relapse. And part of the theory behind that was that they'd be in this very brave, safe space, but the organizational culture was not brave and safe. Not only was it not brave and safe, but it was filled with a lot of white practitioners that weren't paying attention to racism also as a form of trauma. And so I started to think about, wow, this is really interesting. And so how can I kind of look at the organizational culture? And remember, I was a clinician, so my mind frame wasn't a macro. But what I started to do was I thought to myself, social work, person and environment framework. I have to look at the macro structures in order to heal the client. And so I ended up at this, and then at the same time, so hold that piece for a second. And then at the same time, I was also dealing in my master's program with an identity struggle here. So my identity is one that my mom is white and Jewish and my dad is Black and Latino. And I grew up in a home where there was racism and anti-Semitism. And so as a woman who identifies as a Black Latino woman of color, Jewish, at that time in my life, I didn't know where to go. My life was exclusion on every level. I'd go to visit my grandparents who loved me deeply in Florida, and I was told that I was too dark to swim in the pool. I'd spend my summers in Puerto Rico with my dad's family, and I'd hear anti-Semitic slurs. And so there was a part of me that just didn't know where to fit. And it was only through my formal education, getting my master's, reading like social justice warriors and women who also had biracial identities and, you know, Black and Jewish and all of these works that I started to dig deep into who I was. And I realized that I have lived this life of the exclusion. And so my life work really became to create inclusive spaces. And so this book, lives in that space. This book lives in a space of what I call positive disruption, which means disrupting status quo spaces that are inherently exclusive, right? And this book lives in the world of trauma. So when you look at trauma-informed practice, a lot of times we see organizations adopt a trauma-informed lens. But that trauma-informed lens is not necessarily a diverse, equitable, and inclusive lens. It is a trauma-informed lens, but it is not an explicitly a DEI lens, right? DEI work is DEI, and recently it has been filled with understanding, and a lot of work Ken Harding did and a lot of other people understanding that racism is trauma, but traditionally the trauma lens was not included in the DEI work, right? And so what I did with this book was I found a way to tell my story and to use myself. And so, you know, the final piece of this story, and then I'll stop talking because I really want to see what's resonating for people in all of this, and take a sip of water because I'm really thirsty from talking so much, was that during my, I got my PhD, my dissertation was on the social construction of identity. It was a qualitative study. I interviewed 31 women who were from multiracial and multi-ethnic backgrounds. And the study was on their internal identification versus how they're identified externally. And I did that, and it was a wonderful study. And, you know, for those of you that are in the dissertation phase, I really admire where you are right now. And I ended up at Adelphi as an assistant professor. I was about to get tenure, and I always had these dreams of being in administration because I was so also, remember, connected to organizational culture. And so I had the opportunity to serve as associate dean for about a year and a half. And that experience I ended up stepping down from, and it was a conscious, intentional choice because I was a woman of color. I am a woman of color in a predominantly white institution where I had experienced microaggressions, where I had experienced silencing, where I had experienced marginalization. And it was a choice. And, you know, I think of it sometimes as like, you know, self-sacrifice or self-preservation. And, you know, I remember specifically, I have two young daughters, aged 13 and 7 now, but then they were much younger. And so I remember going home a lot, really angry and really tired and really feeling frustrated because I just didn't have the voice that I needed to have in that space. And one of my mentors who also endorsed the book is Dean John Jackson from UPenn, an amazing man. And he taught at Smith. He did a lecture at Smith. I had taught at Smith one summer as a visiting professor for one of their programs. And he came and he talked about generosity. And I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was with my colleague, Dr. Ronnie Verghese, and we were listening to him, and he talked about, you know, a Black man in administration, incredibly brilliant, and how he led and taught from this lens of compassion and generosity. And I thought to myself, wow, like how are you a Black man in a predominantly white field, particularly in administration, and you're holding on to this lens of generosity and compassion. And it was at that moment that I had a shift, and I thought to myself, you know, I want to lean into my higher order purpose of this profession. Like I'm in this profession because I live social justice, right? I'm in this profession because I have a story to tell, and I want to lead from a place of generosity, and I want to lead from a place of compassion. And how do I get back to that? And so, long story short, I stepped down from that position, which was a very good decision for me at that time, because I was able to channel my work into different ways. And so when COVID-19 hit, and I also have I do consulting for a lot of foreign nonprofits, and COVID-19 hit, and a lot of my current clients were saying, you know, let's pause on the DEI work, let's focus on fundraising, and let's focus on safety protocols, and let's focus on remote learning. And I thought to myself, really now? Like, this is the opportune moment to dig into DEI, right? You see the disparity, you see the inequity, like, we can't put a hold on this. And some of them did, right? And then George Floyd was murdered, and my inbox was flooded, and people came back who had said no before, and clients who I held on during this time. We just amped it up. And, you know, it was interesting because it was a moment of reckoning for me in deciding what, if I wanted to work with some organizations, if this was just performative, if this was sincere in this. And I said no to some, but I said yes to even more. And I had to consciously enter this space from a place of hope and possibility. And so that's a long way to tell where this book came from and what it's about. But ultimately, it's about a framework for social work leadership, social work practice that digs into the professional, that tells a story, that forces people to be challenged and to sit with personal feelings of reckoning, and to really understand your higher order purpose as a leader and in this field, and even as an individual in this moment. So I know I said a lot, Samantha, and I'm you know, just thinking about what people are holding on to, but I'd love to have us open up and to hear what resonated for folks.
I completely agree. So if you haven't been to one of our forums, typically you just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Even a
Hi,
comment.
Laura.
Hi.
Hi. Hi. It's good to see you. Hello, everyone. So storytelling as disruption is something that you said that stuck to me. Are you able or willing to share a little bit about when that emerged for you? Like what relationship, who and what were you in relationship with when that came up for you? When you realized that was true?
I think, thanks, Karen, for that question. You know, I don't think it was one moment, but I think every time I started to tell my story to my students in different ways, right? And, you know, my past is full. And I also realized that because this work isn't about, be very intentional about how I'm using my story, right? So depending on what course I'm teaching, depending on what group I'm facilitating or what leader I'm working with, I'll pull on different parts of my narrative to show examples of the ways in which I've disrupted spaces through my storytelling. And I think my storytelling disrupts status quo spaces because so much of my life is not status quo, right? And part of that healing was being okay with that, right? Like my racial and cultural identity, my family history of trauma, my loss at a young age, my divorces, you know, so my stories disrupt spaces and also shows that that's okay, right? That there is no normative way of being, it just is a way of being. And, you know, my mom said this to me the other day, the greatest gift you can give someone and receive is the ability to let yourself be known. And I think in social work, you know, we always talk about person and environment and this, you know, these boundaries. And I think if we allowed ourselves to be known, I think particularly as people of color, we would be able to mitigate implicit bias. We'd be able to build community. We'd be able to hold each other in a deeper way. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer.
Hi, Dr. Quiros.
Hi.
Thank you for this. This is wonderful. Congratulations to you. God bless you for what you're doing. I'm like, as I said, I just graduated in May. Old lady social worker. I came into it thinking, oh, this is what we did all my life. My great grandmother, you know, we give food out, we help people. I thought that was like it. Oh no, there's so much more to it. My last field placement was at a facility where dealing with trauma. And just as you're saying, they taught us how to help the clients through their trauma. But yet there were so many areas, me as a woman of color, I saw and I was like, well, that's not right. And that won't assist her at all. But I couldn't say anything, you know, I mean, I would discuss it with my supervisor, but it was like, oh no, I understand, but it's okay. You know, so I just want to know from you, I want to go on for my PhD because I think there's so much work to be done. And even though I started this late in life, I'm like, no, there's so much work to be done. Any suggestions? I really don't even know what I was asking you, really.
That's okay, Michelle. I want to commend you for where you are right now. I mean, I think the fact that you have a vision of going on to your PhD is amazing, no matter what age you are. It doesn't actually matter. A lot of my students are your age. I just think it's great. So one, congratulations to you. You know, I think as people of color, and particularly, you know, so let me back up a little. Julian and I had this whole discussion about the difference between, particularly in the trauma work, safe and brave spaces. So a lot of times you'll hear clinicians say, this is a safe space. Remember, this is a safe space, but you can't actually guarantee safety. And I think particularly for people of color, when you have white clinicians saying, this is a safe space, as a person of color, if the organization hasn't committed to anti-racist practice, I actually don't believe that, right? So I like to use the word brave. Let's be brave in this space and we can build safety together, right? So that first and foremost, I think that's really important. Second of all, I think that, you know, and it's ironic that Karen asked the first question because we were in a group earlier today together, and part of the skill of doing this work is honoring curiosity. Mm-hmm. I ask a lot of questions because I think if I ask questions, I'm less likely to make theories and I'm more likely to move the person forward. So if I'm noticing, like you, maybe I'm noticing contradictions in the way in which people are working with clients or holding clients, I might go get through that through honoring curiosity and saying, you know, if trauma is supposed to be a safe, collaborative, empowerment space, I'm wondering why, we're not talking about race or racism, and are we leaning in, are we asking clients who they are? Or are we just reading the chapter on African Americans in the book, right? Like, so I think the skill of honoring curiosity takes judgment away and really brings us closer to relationship in that way. And so that's one advice, or not advice, but one suggestion I might give to you. And just pay attention to language, this difference between brave space and safe space, what does that actually mean? And I also think that, really, those of you who are supervising or who are supervisors and are having hesitation about talking about race and culture and supervision, like, why? What is that about? Why can't we talk about whiteness? Why can't we talk about anti-Black sentiment? Why can't we talk about Blackness in a positive way, right? And so I think this field has to be positively disrupted so we can have those conversations and have them be normative. And that means we are creating inclusive spaces that will eventually be equitable spaces. Does that help?
It does. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Quiros. Nice to see you.
Hi, Veronica.
Thank you so much for your book. I'm looking forward to reading it. It was interesting because I called the library, I called HotPog, and they was like, we can't find the book. And then I realized it hasn't come out yet.
Yes, it hasn't come out yet.
It took some curiosity to figure that out. But I think you talked a little bit about supervision, and that was actually part of my question, that sometimes I feel that I'm in the child and adolescent postgraduate program, and I keep hearing the same question. Have you ever had a bilingual supervisor? And I heard it a couple of times and my answer never changed. It kept saying, no, never had one. But I still have a white supervisor. So I'm thinking, can we also, in the social work field, people that are brown, of colors, Hispanic, that speak another language, Asian, all the cultures that and background that we can contribute to the field, to have that braveness that you're talking about, being courage, to have that braveness and seek those opportunities to become those supervisors, to be able to provide in that in the profession in that way, to be able to help people also in that way, because it doesn't make a point, or it doesn't help if you keep asking me the same question and we're not doing anything about it. That to me is nonsense. So either we're going to do this and also go into action, or we're just going to, pet the question. So I think that it takes, courage and being brave to seek those clinical positions too.
I mean, I think, Veronica, what you're also naming is this idea of what I call transformational leadership. Like, leadership has to model that bravery. If you're a lone person in this world, particularly if you're a person of color and you're taking those risks and being brave and you don't have support behind you, you eventually stop doing it, you leave, you get discouraged, you get frustrated. And so, this idea of transformational leadership is self-transformation. It's about being able to use yourself, particularly white leaders, using yourself in a place of allyship. And I don't use that word allyship as a word of rhetoric. I think a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion words have been rhetoric. And my first question when I work with organizations is, you define for me, even in my students, tell me what diversity, equity, inclusion means for you. Tell me what allyship means for you. Tell me how you're showing up in that space. And I think leaders need to really, I talk about, again, this practice of locating yourself. So as leaders, are we locating ourselves and understanding how our own identities impact the way we lead? Right? They impact the way we lead. And for white leaders, they have to look at their whiteness and how that whiteness, and understand the white culture in which has become the normative culture, right? That is, and so as people of color in leadership positions, or even I look at supervisors as leaders too, how are we using ourselves, right, to be able to disrupt status quo, be brave in that space and have support? I think that's particularly challenging for leaders of color when there are no models for that. When I was associate dean, there was no one that looked like me in leadership, right? And so I remember I went to a training, and the name of the training was called Authentic Leadership. And I remember sitting there and I was like, I'm a Latina woman of color and you want me to be authentic in a white space? Like, anytime I get passionate, I get stereotyped. Anytime I kind of step up, I get silenced. Anytime I try to raise my hand, back then it would be, oh, not for now, Laura, or you think you're a savior, Laura, or that, and so I think this is really hard for, like, there's strategy behind this. In my university, I have, 3 close colleagues that I'm constantly negotiating with. And I had a colleague, a white male colleague that I leaned on a lot. He's not at the university anymore, but in faculty meeting, I'd say, could you say this? Because if I say it, I'm not going to be heard. But if you say it, you'll be heard. And so their strategy to this is too, and really being able to be brave, but also as leaders, disrupting those spaces to make them more inclusive.
Hi, my name is Jen, and I'm both an ally and I've always lived a life feeling like I'm an other because of trauma and growing up in poverty and being 2 generations removed from my Portuguese relatives, and the racism that they faced being in California and things like that. And just listening to your work, I've always been a person that I'm very empathetic and I can see things from both sides. I'm a person most comfortable in a room of people who don't look like me. So that's why I say, like, I'm kind of on both sides, is I'm able to almost spiritually be able to relate, but not own another person's, experience in life. And listening to you is just what it really brought up for me. And I apologize for not knowing the topics of your 2 books, but I very am grateful for this conversation. Is to say, is maybe your 3rd book is on how to nurture and fully develop allyship in being seen, and maybe making a movement that grad schools should really do. You should have to do a paper on how you show up. And if you're a person who says, look, I'm white and I come from middle or upper middle class and my parents are still together and I don't know how I show up. It's equally important for them to be able to define how they show up in the world. And what does that mean? And they see people, or, you know, who are telling them, I can't relate to you. So how are you going to meet my needs as my medical social worker, my therapist, my professor, my supervisor? How are you going to be able to talk to people? Yeah. But thank you very much for the conversation.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
You know, it's so funny, Jennifer. Ironically, my colleague and I at work, she's the director of the continuing ed program, we put out a workshop for understanding allyship or unpacking it, disrupting allyship. And we had like 5 people show up. Like and we were both,
yeah,
we might do it again in February, but we had to cancel it because, and I was like, wait a minute, social workers don't want to understand how to be an ally, or do social workers already think they're an ally because they're, you know, they're veiled by this mission of like good intention and social justice, right? So, you know, that's also a reckoning, right? It's a private reckoning.
Absolutely.
Thinking about how on some level there's been complicity in racism, there's been complicity in not disrupting whiteness. And as social workers, I think that's hard because we go into this field with good intention, but we always talk about the difference between intention versus impact. Intention's not good enough. Good intention is great, but if it lands wrong, the intention actually doesn't matter. And are you able to stand in front of that and say, you know what, my intention might have been good, but it didn't land good, and I can own that? Or do you come up with defensiveness and excuses? And, you know, so these are those moments too that need positive disruption, right? In meetings, when that happens, do you stay silent and just text the person after the meeting and say, thanks for raising that up? Or in that meeting are saying, you know what, thanks for being brave. I support you in that space.
Absolutely.
An active allyship. And so, you know, Renee just wrote in the chat, we're offering it again in February. So please sign up. It's CE credits and it'll be great. So thank you.
Is there a mailing list for presentations? Since I'm in California and I, you know.
I think Renee can put her info in the chat and you can reach out to her.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm Bob Shavron, and I traditionally come from left field. I have bits and pieces, and I'm not sure of the drift that guides them. I remember with my middle therapist, at one point in the therapy, he said to me, "Ich bin a Yid," like to establish with me whether I saw myself as being Jewish, and that was a part of our relationship. Another fragment is that different people are more comfortable at different levels of abstraction. Dalai Lama says you should approach any subject with the widest question possible. For me, that question is how to live. Most of what I do goes on one-to-one. I'm coming up on being retired 20 years, and I've got 5 mutual mentoring friends where most of what I do go on. The other issues in terms of religion, one of them is my wife is from Presbyterian background. So technically, according to Jewish law, my daughter is not Jewish because her mother is not Jewish. But strange things that goes on is for about 35 years now, we've been involved with the Unitarian Universalist Church. And if Rebecca would say that to a friend, they have no idea what she was talking about. So she would say she's Jewish. She went to the University of Vermont, and she came back and she says, "Dad, I've got good news and I got bad news." So I said, "Well, what's the bad news?" She says, "I got another tattoo." I said, "Well, what's the tattoo?" And she turns around and she's had a chalice tattooed at the base of her spine. Chalice is one of the things from Unitarianism. It was used to identify a place that Jews could find help sometimes when Nazi Germany was coming into force. Um, those are part of what I am. I am also a Mambo Nick from the late 60s. So I look for fellows who know something about Mambo and dancing. And we've got Jews that come from Spain and Portugal in my background. Maybe that has something to do with my leanings. On a one-to-one basis, I get the drift that the Zen recommendation is often not to allow yourself to be painted into a corner. So I will avoid that whenever possible. If a woman says, oh, the passage in that book is filth, and I will say, I'm into filth, I'm into that. Or my favorite quote from Freud is, I am not a Freudian. So those are the bits and pieces of what goes on for me. And I'm not sure how we could connect.
Thank you, Bob. I think it connects because you were brave enough to share your story and the complexity of all of you. So thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I have a question. Hi, I'm chiming in from Wisconsin, and and being in a leadership position, and being a woman, a person of color, and I'm sure a lot of women on this call as well relate. There comes this double-edged sword, and not only being a person in leadership of color, but also the stigma of the woman, and being, instead of being tough at the table, you're called something else, and things of that nature. And also, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, on your role in writing this book and what you're doing now, a little bit about microaggressions. I find that women in leadership, particularly women of color, deal with them quite often. And, and also, an ally, in intent versus impact, I think is important, and being an ally. And so I was just wondering a little bit if you could talk a bit about microaggressions and, how to best address some of those sometimes in leadership roles, but to still be able to get your message across effectively.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It wasn't until after I stepped down from my position as associate dean, I went right on sabbatical. And it wasn't until I was in sabbatical that I realized just how traumatized I was. Because as you mentioned, microaggressions, macroaggressions, you just hold so much. And oftentimes, I have my close colleagues at my institution, and a woman that I was working with directly, I was able to shut the door and cry to at times when it got too much. But sometimes that's not possible, particularly people in higher administration that are constantly busy and constantly moving. And so it's almost like these macroaggressions are hitting you constantly, whether it's in meetings or whether it's down the hall or whether it's now in Zoom sessions. And, it's like, what do you do with that? And so I think one of the things that I've learned to do with that is, one, as I said before, when I have the headspace, when I have the energy, and in the moment, I'll honor the skill of curiosity and I'll ask a follow-up question to whatever that aggression was, right? So, sometimes I would be asked the question sort of out of the blue. My colleague would be asked like what research they're studying, and I would be asked like, where are you from, or where did you get that sweater, for example. Like the questions I were asked had nothing to do with research or academia at all. And I would ask questions back to those questions to get clarity. There were other times, quite honestly, that I was just so exhausted. And so I'd let those microaggressions hit me until I was able to come home and find a place of peace. I talk a lot about self-care in the sense of self-care, not as like an add-on to lesson 10 in a curriculum or in a syllabi, but self-care is something that's intentional. I think if there was one of the things I learned from my role as associate dean was the importance of daily practices, daily routines, daily affirmations, exercise, self-care that became part of my life. That's not just self-care, but a form of which I was healing. right? And then I would also say that in terms of, you know, I think Samantha mentioned the social work profession right now is doing a lot of work on revolutionizing the profession. And so when I heard that, I felt hopeful that we actually would be in a place where we can be brave enough to acknowledge these microaggressions, where there wouldn't be retaliation. Because, you know, truth be told, I'd acknowledged microaggressions and I was retaliated against, right? Which is one of the reasons why I stepped down. And so I put it on the social work profession to help leaders of color be able to voice these microaggressions without a Title IX being written about them, or without them being demoted, or without them being not included in grant funding and research projects. So that's up to the field, which I feel the field is moving in that direction. And I think lastly, I think creating community is incredibly important. You know, I have 3 very close friends at work, colleagues who are all different and who all enter this work in very different spaces. And, you know, I have to lean on them. I have to have my phone in, you know, faculty meetings to text them if something up. I have to, if something comes up that feels like one of us has been silenced, I have to have a notebook next to me. And so I talk about in my book these practices that relate to transformational leadership. And one of them is mindfulness and intention. And so it's exhausting work, but there's not one meeting or one space I don't go into that I don't prepare mentally to enter that space, because I know on some level, something's going to happen, whether it's to me or whether it's to one of my colleagues of color. And so part of that also is preparing until the institution starts to recognize that this is something that they need to deal with. And I think schools of social work are starting to get the message. Sometimes I feel it's more performative. Sometimes I feel it's more sincere. And so the last thing I'll say to that is that I have to choose. You know, I stepped down from my leadership role because I just couldn't do it anymore. And so I think as adults and people in this field, we have to decide what's best for us, even if that means deferring a dream, even if it is just for a moment. So I know that was a lot, but I hope that I answered your question in some way. Thank you for asking.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Dr. Quiros. I wanted to thank you so much for your transparency and sharing about how you stepped down. It was disappointing, you know, was happy for you when you, but I understand now more than ever. So I really want to thank you for that. And there's some things that I'll share with you another time privately that you had also shared that we have in common that I didn't even know about. So it was very helpful. Thank you. But I wanted to share something with you that I'm hoping that I would really want to work on it after I defend my dissertation. One of the things that I'm having a lot of conversations with colleagues about is in women, BIPOC women in leadership positions that are just so completely frustrated. They want to quit. They want to find another position. And one of the things that I'm finding in common is that their supervisors are also BIPOC women. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And also just a side note that I find that there's also trauma in taking on a leadership position as a BIPOC woman and having to go through all of that, including the microaggressions and the macroaggressions, and then having to, like you said, defer something that you want so much. And there's that pressure on us to break the ceiling, right? So I wanted to just see if you could speak to that for a moment, if possible.
Sure. Which area do you, because it's funny, I'm in the spirit of transparency, when you said that they experienced trauma, I kind of like dissociated for a minute and started to think about different situations. And so I just want to validate that, it is trauma. It is, I say, I say that racism is a form of trauma, and any person of color in predominantly white spaces will feel that trauma, right? Because you're walking into a culture that wasn't necessarily designed for you. And so whether it's trying to assimilate to that culture, push back against that culture, stand up in front of that culture, there is some level of trauma. And I think acknowledging that from a place of acceptance is first really important. And I'm not saying acceptance in the form of submission. I'm saying acceptance. One of the hardest things I've had to do was to accept the realities of my situation, whether it was the realities of being a single mom, the realities of, racism in my family, the realities of not understanding anti-Semitism as it relates to not seeing any Jews of color that looked like me, right? The realities of being a person of color in a predominantly white institution, there's a cost to that. And so I think at different moments in our life, we have to think about how much of that we're willing to take on in that moment. And I also think that, sometimes when people of color are in leadership positions, there's a way in which we also become complicit to racism because we feel like we have to adjust to that normative white culture. And, you know, that's not talked about a lot, but I think that's very real too. And so again, sort of looking at the profession as a way in which women of color and leaders of color can have spaces to talk about these very real realities and to name the trauma that exists without a defensiveness attached to that from the other end, and with an acceptance and a reality and a way to which to move forward from that. So I look forward to connecting with you personally, and thank you for showing up tonight. I appreciate it, and good luck with your defense.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
I wanted to say that, Laura, that I love what your mother said to you about making oneself known. That made me happy.
Thank you. She's here tonight, so I'm sure she would thank you too. So one more question.
Hi, it's Crystal. How you doing?
Hi, Crystal. Good.
I didn't have a question. I just kind of had a comment. And you know what resonated with me when you talked about the positive disruption of the status quo spaces. And you know, I think that being a woman of color in a leadership position, I find that I have to be very intentional about what I'm doing. And I think right now in this environment that we've been in with the unfortunate death of George Floyd and so many others that, you know, was so visible to all of us, that I think for me, what it did, it gave me more braveness, I'll say, in the sense that there's no excuses. And I'm part of our racial justice work in our organization. And we've done a lot of work around some framework. And it's very empowering now that it's coming from the top down, from our commissioner down, to say, you know, no more. And, you know, when you see something, you say something, you don't allow it to continue on. And I think that has been very supportive in a lot of ways. And I just think I would say to a lot of us that of women of color, you know, we get labeled so many things. And you're right, you can come very, you know, it becomes just, okay, that's another name for us, or that's another thing. But when I'm trying to be very intentional when I'm doing, and I'm also pointing out those things to people, because you have to make them aware of what's being said. And it's not okay that you, you know, kind of made some, you know, comment about a family of color that, but you didn't mean anything by it. So I'm right on it. Well, then why would you say it? You know what I mean? So, and it's hard because you are sometimes in those positions where you're looked at like, oh, here we go again. You're being too sensitive. You're being too this, you're being too that. But it's just, I just really like that term, just really the positive disruption, because, you know, you can do the work, but I have my support systems on speed dial sometimes when you're in meetings, because you just need to be validated that, did I just hear what I think I heard? And then when you speak on it, sometimes people are like, well, I really didn't mean it. But I think this is the best time. Unfortunately, it's not the greatest time of COVID, but it's the best time in a lot of ways that the awareness is being brought to a lot of attention, and really having allies on our side to really help us do the work is what's going to help us move this work along, especially as a clinician, as a manager, as a woman of color, all the things that we do to support our families. It's a lot of work, and you can get fatigued by it.
Oh, absolutely.
But I appreciate your work and what you're doing.
I appreciate you and the work that you're doing, and thank you. And
Thank you.
I want to name that positive disruption, and hope everybody takes it and runs with it and finds those spaces that you haven't disrupted before and do it from whatever space you need to. I also think, Crystal, you mentioned this intentionality that can be exhausting. So how are we supporting our colleagues of color? How are we helping carry that load? You know, what are we doing with that? Because that takes so much energy. And so, yeah, there's no greater moment than now to be brave and enter these spaces and you can do it through storytelling. You can do it through so many different ways. And so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's just one thing I'd like to say is that, well, many years ago, I went and got my master's, but his name was Leon Chestang, and he said, character development in a hostile world. And people of color have always had to live amongst the hostility. and now we name it microaggressions. But if you trace back, it was always there. We've renamed it many times, but we have yet to find a way to help other people experience it in a way that we do. So as Crystal said, we're considered hostile. But when you live in a world that at every turn you could be attacked, you know, you do develop certain kind of ways about yourself. And so I just like to say we really should think about how do you help people not put down defenses that they need every day in order to live, in order to be in this world when we look at what's going on.
Thank you for that.
Snap to that. That was awesome, amazing. Everything you just said, I am flabbergasted that I'm just sitting here with you all and really engaged in this. I thank each and every one of y'all for showing up. I am a social work student and just I'm cooking. And sorry guys, you already know how working from home is, but
me too.
Right. the theory of restorative practices brought me to social work, and just to piggyback off of what the young lady said before me, that was my main goal for going out on the limb for this restorative practice, to find out this way to for people to live with their guards down, that they have lived, with their guards up for so long. How do you restore a human? How do you restore that? How do you restore these broken systems? How do you do it?
Thank you so much. Thank you. First of all, Dr. Quiros, this was so awesome. And as you can tell, no one wants to stop. We all want to keep talking. I want to thank you. As I'm wrapping up, can you put in the chat how people can contact you or reach you, or the best way to talk to you? So what I heard from everyone tonight is that you all are ready for change and you all want to be part of the change. Well, I have good news for you. At NASW New York State, we are working on the change. So we have 6 racial justice initiatives that we're doing at the chapter. Amelia will be putting a link in the chat box, so you can go and look at all our different racial justice initiatives. But one of our initiatives that's really taken off, that we've had people from all over the world join us in this, is our Revolutionize the Profession. And the purpose of Revolutionize the Profession is to make social work a racially just profession. And we've been working on this since July through a series of town halls. These are free and open to everyone. You don't have to be a member. This whole initiative is led by BIPOC social workers. And it's really amplifies the voices of BIPOC voices. We've already created goals for schools of social work and how to make them racially just. And next week, we're moving on to clinical social work. So I just heard from a couple of different clinical social workers here that I am hoping will join us. Amelia will put the link in so you can register. We need your voice in this. We need you to be a part of this so we can create these goals and we can work on this together. So I welcome everyone to join us. And then now I just want to ask Amelia, who won our free 2 books that we're giving away?
Yes, so we used an automated generator of everyone who attended, and I put everyone's name in, cut it off at, I think it was 6:35. So I've tried to chat both of y'all, but oops, I'm sorry, I missed it. I lost it. Give me 1 second. I'm so silly. Everyone is thinking, and I lost my place. Okay, so Jovan Goodman is one of our winners, and Sandra Marty is our second winner. Oh, I see Sandra. Yes. So glad to be able to giving these books away. I already got some information for Jovan, but Sandra, if you want to stay on the line with us, we'll connect and make sure that we get the right information to get that book to you.
So we will be mailing those to you as soon as we get them. They're going to be shipped to me and I will mail them to you as soon as we get them. We need your address, so stay on with us. I think Jovan already gave her address to Amelia. And really, I just want to end with final words from you, Laura. How would you like to leave everyone tonight?
I'd like to leave everyone with envisioning. So one of the things about social justice work is to envision a place where there is diversity, equity, inclusion in whatever space that is. So I would love people to take part in a envisioning exercise. I hope that people are leaving inspired and brave, and I hope that people hold this theoretical and practice of positive disruption close to their heart. And mostly, I wish everybody safety and love as we move through this pandemic, and hope for a better place for all of us. So thank you, everyone, truly, for sharing space with me tonight from my heart.